Defining gentrification has been really hard in the past, only because it's a subjective term, because there's many different beliefs about it, and so there's never really been a consensus on what it means. Throughout this literature debate of what it means, some authors define gentrification as private sector initiated residential and commercial investment in urban neighborhoods accompanied by inflows of households with higher socioeconomic status than the neighborhood's initial residents. Sometimes opposing authors to gentrification, they like to add additional information to this definition by stating that the initial residents are displaced in the These definitions are different because the authors who are against gentrification, they typically add information about the word that gives it a negative connotation to inform people that the process has unsatisfactory results. So it's just as hard to define gentrification as it is to kind of explain why it happens. So there's a book called Gentrification, Displacement, and Neighborhood Revitalization, written by authors J. John Palin and Bruce London, and they discuss the explanations of what they believe causes gentrification, and the causes are listed right here on the slides, and I'm going to go through all of them. They are demographic, ecological, sociocultural, political, economic, community networks, and social movements. So the first theory is demographic ecological, and it attempts to explain gentrification through the analysis of demographics, such as like population, social organization, environment, and technology. And as these things change throughout the years, they're used to analyze how these things have affected the community. A common example used to explain this theory is when the baby boomers began looking for housing, because the number of people that were looking for housing increased, the demand for it also increased, and there wasn't enough supply to keep up with the demand. Therefore, certain cities were, I guess, revitalized or quote-unquote recycled to meet the demands. The baby boomers were very different when they were looking for housing demographically than the previous group of people who were house hunting. They typically married at an older age and had fewer children, and their children were born later, and also more women were entering the workforce, and there were more like affluent couples without children. And so because of that, they weren't really concerned with being in neighborhoods with schools or playgrounds or I guess like suburbs. They would rather have lived in the inner city to be closer to their jobs, which then changed the demographics of the inner city. So the second theory proposed by London and Palin is based on a sociocultural explanation. This theory argues that, the values, attitudes, ideas, etc., should be used to explain and predict human behavior. Therefore, also focusing on the changing attitudes and lifestyles of people in the gentrified neighborhoods, but most importantly, focusing on the changing attitudes and lifestyles and values of the people, coming into these neighborhoods to gentrify them. One example that this theory kind of explains is like the changes in attitudes and beliefs of urban living of the upper and middle class of the 1970s. They were becoming more pro-urban and decided that they did not want to live in rural or suburban areas anymore. So due to this change in attitude, more people started moving into the cities and away from rural areas. A lot of people argue that dominant American values actually influences people's choices on where to live. So they use that to kind of insinuate that people are moving into gentrified areas to restore it and not necessarily to completely transform it. The third explanation of gentrification is political economic, and it's divided into two different approaches. The traditional approach argues that economic and political factors have led to the invasion of the inner city. However, that it's not intentional. So an example would be like the changing political and legal climate in the 1960s, there was like less of a prejudice against blacks, so whites were more willing to move into the city, and blacks were moving into the suburbs more. And also, an economic example is how the suburbs, there was like less availability of land and also an inflation in suburban housing costs, which also inspired the invasion of the cities. The Marxist approach, it says that the political and economic influences on gentrification are invisible. However, these ones are intentional. So, a quote from London and Palin's book, it says that this theory claims that powerful interest groups follow a policy of neglect of the inner city until such time as they become aware that policy changes could yield tremendous profits. So basically, they realize that the inner city can be a source of revenue, and therefore these groups will do whatever they want to gentrify it because they want this profit. Therefore, they displace the initial residents. So the fourth approach is the community network approach. And in this one, they like to view the community as an interactive social group. And so there are two perspectives, which is community loss and community save. And so the community loss perspective, it argues that the role of the neighborhood is being more limited due to like large to huge advances in, like communication and transportation. So the like small scale local community is kind of being replaced by these like large scale organizations. And on the opposing side, the community save side, they're arguing that this increase in like technological advances is also increasing community activity, and that this gentrification is also increasing community activity because these neighborhoods are being revitalized. So the fifth and final approach to the causes of gentrification are social movements, which focuses on the influence of ideologically based movements. So commonly when a new gentrifying project is being discussed, the people who support it are following a leader. And this leader is someone who, works firsthand in the government or is involved in the renewal process by being a part of the company or, whatever. However, the people who strongly disagree are most commonly members from the community that's being gentrified. Therefore, their opinions kind of like less matter to, the leaders. And also occasionally there are some community members that are pro, renovation of the community. And those are the voices that the leaders tend to listen to. And so because of that, there's not a lot of input for every gentrifying project from both sides. Therefore, they go with the project anyway, and then the community is still greatly affected. So how does gentrification connect to race? The biggest reason is displacement, and the gentrification reader defines displacement as a forced disenfranchisement of poor and working class people from the spaces and places in which they have legitimate social and historical claims. Displacement is actually one of the most studied negative aspects of gentrification, and it's generally agreed and is a general consensus that those that are displaced are primarily minorities, elderly, and transient groups, but particularly neighborhoods with minorities, and they're always driven out of these areas where gentrification occurs. So an example of this is when properties are revitalized and it then increases the rent, and the current tenants, their income can no longer afford living where they are. Therefore, they're forced to move to surrounding neighborhoods that aren't gentrified or have not been gentrified yet, and allows for more affluent people to move in because they can afford these property values. Also, a lot of the times the people who are gentrified, not only can they no longer afford where they live, like they have a lack of economic resources, but they also typically lack a lot of political power, and they're easily exploited by landlords. Therefore, they're just kind of like forced to leave because they're like unable to resist gentrification, because without political power they can't help put input in on not gentrifying neighborhoods, and because they are exploited by landlords, their rent is like rising without a care from them. So now I'm going to show some examples of gentrification, specifically in Portland, just because there's been such an increase in it. In fact, here's some facts about Portland and gentrification. There was a report from Governing Magazine that found that they had the highest percentage of eligible census tracts that could be gentrified, which was 58.1%. And a little background on this report: the team compared eligible census tracts in America's 50 largest cities between 2000 and 2013. And so they defined a census tract. The eligibility criteria was that in 2000, the median household income and median home value were both in the bottom 40th percentile of all tracts within a metro area. And they considered a tract gentrified if by 2013 both of those conditions fell in the top third percentile, which is like a huge increase. So the fact that 58.1% of census tracts currently in Portland are eligible to be gentrified is extreme and can change the demographics of Portland immensely. Because of this study, Portland was actually rated the most gentrified city between 2000 and 2013. And also, Portland's rent rose at the sixth fastest rate in the last 5 years, which, if you go back to how, rent rates are increased because of gentrification, that just goes to show that there is a lot happening, a lot of gentrification. And if there wasn't so much happening, maybe that rate, the rent rate, wouldn't increase so quickly. So, one of the main examples that a lot of people use to explain the effects of gentrification in Portland is the Alberta neighborhood. Previously, the Alberta neighborhood was seen as a predominantly African American community, and now that isn't the case anymore. Currently, the population is more mixed, and the community is tailored to the hipster crowd by like the businesses that are there. There are local businesses, however, they are tailored to a more hipster crowd with like, thrift shops and like these cool little quirky, lounges or coffee shops. So there were 2 studies done that were organized by Grice and Bob Zybeck. I think that's how you pronounce it. One of them was done in 1992 and the other one was done in 2015. And what they did was they hired local young African Americans to, interview residents and business owners and do research on the area by like demographics, education, real estate, so they could, look at the effects of gentrification. So they compared the results that they got in 92 to the results that they got in 2015 to have a detailed look at the effects of gentrification and the changes that occur because of it, and what happens to these lower income areas. So again, to kind of show how gentrification connects to race, from these studies, they noticed that the Black communities that were previously in Alberta have been dispersed. So in 1992, there were 20 Black-owned businesses, and in 2015, the number was the same. I don't know if the businesses were the same, but the number was. However, the total number of businesses in the area was 79 in 1992 and then went from 220. So you obviously see that more businesses are coming in to this neighborhood and changing it a lot. However, there's not very many opportunity for the previous residents or the current local residents who are African American to increase their businesses and rise up as well. One of the most important facts is that in 1992, 50% of the people in the Alberta neighborhood were African American, and in 2015, it was actually 20%. So there's been a decrease in the amount of African Americans in that community because they are being displaced and dispersed to other communities because they can no longer afford to live there and probably don't even feel a part of the community anymore since it is different and tailored to this new crowd that they can't relate to and have never been a part of. I also included on this slide a picture of an area in the Alberta neighborhood from 92 to 2015. And I mean, you can see the difference in how it looks and how it's tailored to a different crowd. And, granted, there's a huge year gap and a lot of communities change, but the fact that it's tailored to a different demographic than before because those communities were displaced is really unfortunate. So another example is a new project to build a new Seasons in St. John's, which currently it's actually already open. But during the discussion about it, some people thought that putting the new Seasons there will do the community some good. However, a lot of people were afraid that it would have more of a negative effect and, increase the surrounding land's property values, which would then increase, the property values of their homes. And also, New Seasons, they're putting this location in a neighborhood that is primarily low income, but a lot of their products have very high prices, which makes it difficult for the residents currently living there to even afford anything from there. So, people argue, like, are they purposely, drawing in a certain type of population, which would be, this affluent, like white group of people coming into this neighborhood that not only is predominantly low income, but also predominantly minorities, and is also the neighborhood that I live in. So kind of seeing an example of gentrification in my own neighborhood that's like 10 blocks away is it's kind of very hard to like see it happen and have people be okay with it, because it's obvious that, New Seasons isn't a company that would typically be in this community. And so it shows, residents that the city, wants New Seasons here to develop this brand new location to purposely draw out the population. And there's, been more projects in St. John's that have gentrified it, and the hipster crowd is kind of going into St. John's as well. And there's more, rental developments to help support, these new residents in their really expensive condos. So, Portland, there's a lot of gentrification that happens there, and a lot that can be done to prevent it and stop it from happening. So if you ever wanted to get a little bit more information on gentrification or actually see visual examples, South Park actually recently released a series of episodes that touched on this topic that I actually thought, were really good, and they kind of showed, how gentrification affects people. And one example was that Kenny's neighborhood was gentrified with a lot of upscale bars and lounges for, the type of residents that the city wanted to bring in. Like, they were purposely, putting all these businesses in this neighborhood to bring us, affluent people to South Park. Another example is because of this gentrification, it increased property values, and Stan's parents, they couldn't they were no longer able to afford their home, and Stan's dad even like took out a ton of loans to afford their mortgage payment and to also afford, this new lifestyle that came with the gentrified neighborhood. The city, also the city government, the mayor, she wanted to show that South Park is a good city and revitalize it to bring in new residents. So they actually show that in the show that the city government is intentionally gentrifying neighborhoods. And, a lot of times people don't actually say, I'm going to gentrify a neighborhood today. And they still didn't say that, but it was obvious what she was trying to do. Another example is that they wanted to bring Whole Foods to South Park, which is like, example of people wanting New Seasons or Trader Joe's in their neighborhood to, again, tailor to this new influx of, affluent white people or like the hipsters. I suggest, checking out these episodes. It's like a series of about 4 or 5. I think they're pretty good and that they do a really good job at showing, the negative effects of gentrification and why it should be prevented. And although, the population in South Park, they're not predominantly minorities. It's still a predominantly, low-income neighborhood, which is also commonly targeted by gentrifiers. So that's important to note as well. Gentrification is probably something that's never going to end, or that's going to be really hard to end and prevent. So some things that can be done to help prevent it is if the city, the government started asking, the community members from the community that they were intending to gentrify their opinion on these new projects. I think that's one of the best ways to get to end it is by getting input from the community members, because they have the closest relationship with that community, so they probably have a more accurate opinion on what's good and bad for that community. Another way is for those community members, they get more involved in local voting and possibly vote for city officials that are more for the people and value community opinions versus the ones that kind of just, do what they want or not really care about input from the people that they're supposed to be, helping and making these policies for. Another thing that can be done is, a counter movement or like a type of social movement that advocates for, anti-gentrification and the revitalization of these neighborhoods and making sure that they remain authentic to how they originally were and to the original residents that were there. This last slide is just a list of my references if anyone wants to, look into this more and get more of their own research. There's a lot more details about gentrification that I didn't include that are important, and also more examples of gentrification outside of Portland and even outside the West Coast that are important. So I hope you enjoy my project, and thanks for listening.